Picture a hat shop in 17th century London. A wealthy customer is being fitted for the most fashionable accessory a European gentleman can own, a tall, felted hat, stiff and glossy, holding its shape in a way no other material can manage. The secret is in the fur used to make it beaver, and specifically the microscopic barbs on each individual beaver hair, which lock together under heat and pressure into a felt so dense and durable it can be steamed into almost any shape and hold it for decades. Hat makers of the era developed an entire specialized process just to exploit this property, separating the soft underfur from the coarser outer guard hairs, then matting the underfur together using heat, moisture, and mercury-based compounds that, unrelated to this story but worth a passing mention, were toxic enough to give hatters chronic tremors and mental decline, the actual historical origin of the phrase "mad as a hatter." Europeans didn't just like beaver hats. For roughly 2 centuries, they were willing to reshape an entire continent to keep getting them. That's not an exaggeration. Here's what actually happened. By the early 1600s, European beavers had already been hunted to near extinction across most of the continent, driven by exactly this demand. Fur traders, desperate for a new supply, found it in North America, where beaver populations were still abundant across an enormous network of rivers and lakes stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the continental interior. That single animal became the primary economic engine pulling European traders, explorers, and colonial governments into the heart of North America, decades before most agricultural settlers ever got anywhere near the same territory. It's worth appreciating just how consequential that hunting pressure actually was on the landscape itself, separate from the human conflicts it triggered. Beavers are what ecologists call a keystone species, building dams that create entire wetland ecosystems, flooding forest into marsh, and radically reshaping local hydrology wherever they establish themselves in large numbers. Trapping beaver populations down to near collapse across huge stretches of the continent, as the fur trade eventually didn't just remove an animal, it collapsed thousands of small artificial wetlands, altering water tables, fish populations, and forest composition across an enormous portion of North America in ways ecologists are still mapping out today. The UEO competition to control that fur trade produced entire companies built almost exclusively around it. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered by England in 1670, was granted an almost unimaginable territorial claim, an enormous swath of land draining into Hudson Bay, known as Rupert's Land, covering a huge portion of what's now Canada, handed to a private trading company specifically because of the fur wealth flowing through it. The company operated more like a small sovereign government than a business, building forts, negotiating directly with indigenous nations, and effectively administering a territory larger than most European countries combined, all justified by the value of a single animal's pelt. French traders, meanwhile, built their own competing network centered on the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, sending trappers and traders known as coureurs des bois deep into the interior to live among and trade directly with indigenous communities, often adopting local languages and customs in the process. The two sides didn't just compete peacefully. Indigenous nations across the Great Lakes region, drawn into the trade as suppliers and increasingly dependent on European goods obtained through it, firearms, metal tools, cloth, fought a series of brutal conflicts historians now call the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois Confederacy, armed by Dutch and English trading partners, fought to control hunting grounds and trade routes against French-allied nations like the Huron Confederacy. Those wars devastated entire indigenous nations, reshaping the political map of the region for generations, with some estimates suggesting the Huron Confederacy lost the majority of its population to warfare, disease, and displacement within just a few devastating years. The rivalry between French and English fur interests didn't stay confined to indigenous territory either. It became one of the underlying tensions feeding into the French and Indian War, fought across the 1750s and 60s, a conflict that determined which European power would control the interior of North America going forward. England's eventual victory, and the territorial settlements that followed, laid much of the groundwork for exactly where the modern border between the United States and Canada would eventually be drawn, a border shaped in no small part by decades of competition over an animal's fur. So that's what happened. Now otherwise, picture that same London hat shop, except beaver felt never becomes the fashion obsession it did. Maybe some other material, wool felt, or a fabric that never quite goes out of style the way beaver eventually did, simply dominates European hat making from the start. And demand for beaver pelts never spikes into the continent-shaping economic force it actually became. Without that specific demand, the entire timeline of European penetration into North America's interior slows down dramatically. Fur wasn't just one export among many. It was the primary reason European traders pushed hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles inland along river systems, decades before agricultural colonization reached anywhere near the same territory. Explorers like Etienne Brulé and later La Salle mapped enormous stretches of the continental interior, specifically while following fur trade routes and indigenous trading partnerships, producing the earliest detailed European knowledge of the Great Lakes and Mississippi watershed. Remove the beaver hat craze, and there's far less economic reason for anyone to venture that far from the coast that early. The interior of the continent likely stays under indigenous control, largely undisturbed by European traders and the goods, weapons, and diseases they brought with them, for a meaningfully longer stretch of time. The Hudson's Bay Company almost certainly never receives a charter this expansive either, since the entire justification for granting one private company control over such an enormous territory was the fur wealth flowing out of it. Without Rupert's Land as a foundational territorial claim, the specific shape of British claims across northern and western Canada loses one of its earliest and most important building blocks. Some of that territory might eventually fall under a different European power's influence, or might simply remain contested indigenous territory for much longer before any European claim gets seriously asserted over it at all. The Beaver Wars themselves, or something resembling them, likely never happen on the same scale either. Without the same fierce economic competition to control fur trade routes, the Iroquois Confederacy has far less reason to wage the same series of devastating campaigns against neighboring nations. The Huron Confederacy, effectively destroyed in our actual history by the mid-1600s, plausibly survives as a significant regional power for much longer, changing the entire balance of indigenous political power across the Great Lakes for generations afterward, a version of history where fewer nations get wiped off the map before European colonization ever seriously threatens any of them directly. A surviving, powerful Huron Confederacy, along with other nations that historically suffered heavy losses during this period, would have brought considerably more organized indigenous political and military weight to the table during every subsequent negotiation, treaty, and conflict involving European powers moving into the region. Some historians who study this alternate scenario argue that a stronger, more unified indigenous presence across the Great Lakes could have meaningfully slowed or reshaped the pace of later European settlement expansion, simply by presenting a more formidable, better organized opposing force at exactly the moments when colonial expansion was most vulnerable to serious resistance. Follow that forward, and the French and English rivalry that eventually produced the French and Indian War loses much of its original fuel. That doesn't mean the two empires never clash over North American territory. Broader imperial competition between France and Britain was happening across the globe throughout this period, for reasons that had nothing to do with beaver pelts. But the specific timeline, the specific territories contested first, and the specific alliances formed with which indigenous nations could all look meaningfully different without fur wealth as the primary prize driving early conflict in the interior and that reshapes the eventual border itself. Large stretches of the modern boundary between the United States and Canada trace directly back to territorial claims first, established by fur trading companies and the treaties that followed decades of competition between them. The later Oregon boundary dispute in the 19th century which settled the western portion of that same border, was itself substantially shaped by competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and rival American fur enterprises, pushing into the Pacific Northwest, each side using their fur trading posts and territorial claims as leverage in the eventual diplomatic settlement. Remove the specific economic engine that justified pushing that deep into the continent that early, and the eventual dividing line between two of the world's most stable, peaceful neighboring nations might have ended up drawn somewhere else entirely, decided by whichever powers and interests actually did drive colonization of the interior instead. So maybe the strangest part of this whole otherwise scenario isn't the war, or the company, or even the border. It's the fact that one of the longest peaceful international borders on the planet, a line separating two entire nations today, crossed casually by millions of people, every year without a second thought, owes a meaningful part of its specific shape to which fur happened to look best on a European gentleman's head 300 years ago. There's something almost comedic about that, sitting right alongside how genuinely consequential it turned out to be. Nobody involved in that London hat shop was thinking about international borders, indigenous political survival, or the long-term hydrology of North American wetlands. They were thinking about looking fashionable. And yet that ordinary, forgettable impulse toward looking good set off a chain of economic incentives that quietly outlived every single person who ever wore one of those hats. Still visible today in the shape of a line on a map that most people crossing it have never once connected back to felt. If a fashion trend for a single kind of hat could end up quietly shaping the borders of an entire continent, it raises a strange question worth carrying forward. How many other lines on the map we treat as historically inevitable actually trace back to something as small, as ordinary, and as easy to overlook as what people simply happened to want to wear? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the borders and nations shaped by things far too small to expect. Subscribe and find out what else quietly drew the lines.